The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the city as Marcus stepped out of his car and adjusted his tie. He had just wrapped up another long shift at the corporate office where he worked tirelessly as an assistant manager. The pay wasn't great, but it kept the bills paid, and Marcus was always grateful for the opportunity even if the days were exhausting. Tonight he needed to pick up a few things from the small convenience store near his apartment, a quick errand before heading home to rest. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted winter was around the corner, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter as he crossed the street. The neighborhood wasn't exactly the safest, but he lived here for years and had learned how to keep to himself and avoid trouble. Also, he thought. As he stepped into the store, the familiar ding of the doorbell greeted him. The place was nearly empty except for the cashier, a young guy named Kenny, who always nodded at Marcus when he came in. Marcus gave a polite nod back before heading to the back aisle where the milk and bread were stocked. He didn't notice the man who had entered the store just moments after him, the man wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. Marcus picked up a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, mentally ticking off the items on his list. He moved toward the front of the store, reaching for a pack of gum near the counter. That's when he heard it, a voice low and sharp cutting through the quiet. "Hands up. Empty the register." Marcus froze, his hand hovering over the gum. Slowly he turned his head toward the front of the store. The man in the hoodie was standing at the counter, a gun pointed directly at Kenny. The cashier's hands were shaking as he fumbled to open the register. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't a stranger to dangerous situations. Growing up in a tough neighborhood had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't something he could walk away from without being involved. He was trapped. The man in the hoodie glanced around the store, his eyes landing on Marcus. "You. Over there," Doug Movie barked. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his mind racing. He could feel the tension in the room, the way every second stretched into an eternity. He didn't dare make any sudden movements, but his brain was working overtime, analyzing every detail. The man's stance, his voice, the way his hand trembled slightly as he held the weapon. Kenny finally managed to open the register, and the man started grabbing handfuls of cash, shoving it into a worn backpack. For a brief moment, it seemed like the ordeal might end without further escalation. But then, as the man backed away from the counter, his gaze flicked to Marcus again. "You got a wallet?" he demanded, gesturing with the gun. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yet," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and holding it up. "Toss it over," the man ordered. Marcus hesitated for the briefest of moments, a flicker of defiance crossing his mind. But he knew better than to provoke someone holding a weapon. He tossed the wallet onto the floor near the man's feet. The man snatched it up and gave Marcus one last glare before turning and bolting out the door. The sound of his footsteps echoed into the night, followed by the screech of tires as he sped off in an old car waiting just outside. The store was silent for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerators in the back. Kenny let out a shaky breath, leaning heavily against the counter. Marcus's hands slowly lowered, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. But as the shock began to wear off, something else started to take its place. A simmering anger. Marcus glanced down at the empty spot where his wallet had been. Inside that wallet were not just his ID and credit cards, but something far more personal. A small photograph of his late mother, the only one he had left. His jaw tightened as he looked toward the door, the cold night beyond seeming to whisper a challenge. He wasn't the type to seek revenge, but this wasn't just about the money or even the photo. This was about respect, about standing up for himself in a world that often seemed determined to knock him down. Marcus didn't know it yet, but this moment would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone involved. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Are you okay?" Kenny asked, his voice breaking the silence. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the door. "Yeah," he said, though his tone carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "But this isn't over." And with that, Marcus turned and walked out of the store, his mind already working on the next steps. What he was about to do would defy expectations, shock everyone who knew him, and leave a mark that would be remembered for a long time to come. Little did he know the journey he was about to embark on would test his strength, his resolve, and his very sense of justice. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Marcus stepped out into the cold night, the air biting at his skin as he took a deep breath. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting uneven pools of light on the cracked pavement. His mind was racing, replaying the events in the store over and over. He felt the weight of his missing wallet, Not the cash, but the photo tucked inside. It was the last thing his mother had given him before she passed, a keepsake he held onto through every difficult moment in his life. Losing it felt like losing her all over again, and that was something he couldn't accept. He walked home with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his footsteps echoing against the silent buildings. The neighborhood always had an edge to it, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. As he reached the front door of his apartment building, Marcus paused. His reflection stared back at him in the glass door, his eyes hard and determined. Inside, the apartment was quiet. The small one-bedroom space was modest but clean, a testament to Marcus's pride in making the best of what he had. He dropped the bag of groceries on the counter and slumped onto the couch, staring at the blank wall in front of him. Normally, he would turn on the TV to unwind, but tonight he couldn't focus on anything else. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a text from his best friend, Dishon. "Yo, you good? Saw some commotion down by the store. Everything okay?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before typing back. "Got robbed. Lost my wallet. I'm fine though." The response was almost immediate. "What? Who did it?" "You call the cops." Marcus stared at the screen. Calling the cops had crossed his mind, but he knew how these things usually went. In this part of town, a robbery at a small convenience store wasn't exactly a high-priority case. Even if they bothered to show up, chances were slim they'd find the guy. Didn't call. What's the point? They won't do anything. Deshon's next message came after a pause, as though he was choosing his words carefully. "Man, I hear you, but don't do anything crazy. Let it go. Let it go." The words echoed in Marcus's mind, and for a fleeting moment he considered it. Maybe Dishon was right. Maybe this was just one of those things you had to chalk up to bad luck. But then he thought about the photo again, the way his mother's smile lit up her face in that picture. He couldn't let it go. Not this time. The next morning, Marcus woke up early, his mind still buzzing with plans. He had barely slept, but the exhaustion didn't matter. He called in sick to work, something he almost never did, and spent the morning walking the streets near the convenience store. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a clue, maybe the car the man had driven off in. The city was alive with its usual chaos. Honking cars, street vendors shouting to passers-by, and people rushing to wherever they needed to be. Marcus kept his head on a swivel, scanning every alley, every parked car, every face that passed him. He knew it was a long shot, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had robbed him wasn't too far away. As he turned a corner, he spotted a group of teenagers hanging out near a graffiti-covered wall. They were laughing and talking, but one of them caught his eye. A tall guy with a backpack slung over one shoulder. It wasn't the same guy from the store, but the backpack looked eerily similar. Marcus hesitated, debating whether to approach them. "Hey man," he said finally, his voice steady but cautious as he walked up to the group. The teenagers fell silent, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. "What you want?" one of them asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "That backpack," Marcus said, nodding toward it. "Where'd you get it?" The tall guy frowned, pulling the strap tighter over his shoulder. "Why are you asking?" Marcus held up his hands, trying to keep the situation calm. "Look, I'm just trying to find someone. Got robbed last night, and the guy had a bag just like that. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need some answers." The group exchanged glances, and for a moment, Marcus thought they might blow him off. But then the tall guy sighed, his expression softening. "Got this from my cousin a couple weeks ago," he said. "Don't know where he got it though." "Your cousin around here?" Marcus asked, his heart pounding. The guy hesitated before shaking his head. "Nah, he's out of town. Look, I don't know nothing about no robbery. Sorry, man." Marcus nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Thanks anyway." As he walked away, frustration bubbled inside him. He felt like he was chasing shadows, grasping at leads that went nowhere. But he couldn't stop now. The day stretched on, and Marcus continued his search, asking questions and keeping his eyes peeled for anything that seemed out of place. He visited a few local pawn shops, hoping someone might have tried to sell his wallet or its contents, but every shopkeeper shook their head when he described it. By the time the sun began to set again, Marcus was exhausted and no closer to finding the man who had robbed him. He sat on a bench in a small park, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. He felt the weight of defeat settling over him, but deep down he knew he couldn't give up. Just as he was about to head home, his phone buzzed. It was a call from Kenny, the cashier at the store. "Hey, Marcus," Kenny said, his voice nervous. "I didn't want to say anything yesterday, but I think I might have recognized the guy who robbed us." Marcus sat up straight, his grip tightening on the phone. "What do you mean? You know him?" "Not exactly," Kenny said, "but I've seen him around before. He hangs up near that old warehouse on 5th Street. You know the one?" Marcus did know it, a crumbling building on the edge of the neighborhood, a place people avoided if they could help it. "Thanks, Kenny," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I owe you one." As he ended the call, Marcus felt a spark of hope reignite within him. He wasn't sure what he'd find at the warehouse, but it was the first solid lead he had all day. With the sky darkening above him, Marcus stood and began making his way toward 5th Street. His footsteps were firm, his jaw set. He didn't know what awaited him at the warehouse, but one thing was certain. He wasn't turning back now. Each step brought him closer to the unknown, and with it, a growing sense of anticipation. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he had anticipated. But no matter what lay ahead, he was ready to face it. As Marcus approached 5th Street, the faint hum of the city seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. It was the kind of place that stories were told about, a building with its own whispers of danger and secrecy. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he neared the entrance, but he pushed the nerves down. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. The streetlights barely reached this part of the neighborhood, leaving the area bathed in shadows. Marcus scanned his surroundings, careful to stay alert. A few figures lingered near the side of the warehouse, their movements subtle but deliberate. He couldn't tell if they were connected to the man who had robbed him, but their presence was enough to keep him on edge. He slipped into the shadows, his footsteps light as he circled the building. From a cracked window, Marcus could hear muffled voices carrying from inside. His heart raced as he crept closer, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the glass, he could see a group of people gathered around a dimly lit table, their faces partially obscured by the flickering light of a single bulb. Among them was a man wearing a familiar hoodie, the same one from the night before. Marcus felt a rush of anger and adrenaline. This was it, the lead he'd been chasing. But as he watched, he realized the situation was more complicated than he had imagined. The group wasn't just hanging out. There was an air of tension in the room, the kind that hinted at plans being made, deals being struck. He couldn't hear their words clearly, but the body language was enough to tell him that this wasn't a casual gathering. One of the men at the table pulled out a stack of cash and began counting it, his movements deliberate. Marcus' eyes narrowed as he recognized the bills, crumpled 20s and 10s, just like the ones from the convenience store register. His stomach turned. This wasn't just about a random robbery. There was something bigger going on, and Marcus was now tangled in the middle of it. He moved away from the window, his mind racing. He needed to figure out his next move. Confronting them now would be reckless. He was outnumbered and out of his depth. But walking away wasn't an option either, not when he was this close to getting answers. He decided to wait, hoping for an opportunity to catch one of them alone. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Marcus kept to the shadows, his patience wearing thin. Finally, the group began to disperse, their laughter echoing faintly in the night as they exited the warehouse one by one. The man in the hoodie lingered behind, pulling his backpack over his shoulder before stepping out into the cold air. Marcus followed at a safe distance, his pulse quickening with every step. The man walked with a casual confidence, completely unaware that he was being tailed. Marcus's mind raced with possibilities, each one more daring than the last. He needed to confront him, but he also needed answers. Why had he targeted the store? Was this just about the money, or was there something else at play? The man turned down an alley, the narrow space barely lit by a flickering light at the far end. Marcus saw his chance. He quickened his pace, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. As he closed the distance, he felt a surge of determination. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice firm but not aggressive. The man stopped, his shoulders tensing as he turned to face Marcus. His hand instinctively went to his side, but he froze when he saw Marcus standing there, unarmed but resolute. "You remember me?" Marcus asked, his tone steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The man's eyes darted to the ground before meeting Marcus' gaze again. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Don't play dumb," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "Last night, the store, you took my wallet." The man hesitated, his stance shifting as though he was preparing to run. But something in Marcus' expression stopped him. Perhaps it was the quiet intensity, the unwavering determination. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Look, man, I didn't mean nothing by it," he said, his tone defensive. "Times are hard, you know. I just needed the cash." Marcus clenched his jaw, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "It wasn't just about the cash," he said, his voice sharp. "There was a picture in that wallet. A picture that meant everything to me. Where is it?" The man's face faltered, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't even look inside. Just grabbed the money and tossed the rest." Marcus' chest tightened. The idea of his mother's photo lying discarded somewhere, forgotten and trampled, was almost too much to bear. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Where?" he demanded. "Where'd you toss it?" The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though the walls were closing in. "Behind the warehouse," he said finally. "There's a dumpster. Might still be there." Marcus didn't wait for further explanation. He turned and sprinted back toward the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The night felt colder now, the air slicing against his skin as he ran. When he reached the back of the building, he didn't hesitate. He dove toward the dumpster, his hands rummaging through the trash with a desperation he had never felt before. The smell was overwhelming, but Marcus didn't care. He sifted through broken glass, crumpled papers, and other discarded items, his fingers numb from the cold. Finally, his hand brushed against something familiar, a worn leather wallet, stained but intact. He pulled it out, his breath catching as he opened it. The cash was gone, of course, but Marcus didn't care about that. His eyes scanned the contents until they landed on the photograph. It was slightly crumpled, the edges bent, but his mother's smile was still there, shining through the grime. He let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him like a wave. But as Marcus stood there, clutching the photo, he realized this wasn't the end. The man's words echoed in his mind. Times are hard. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a truth Marcus couldn't ignore. He had his wallet back, but the questions remained. What had pushed that man to such desperation? And what was really going on at that warehouse? The answers were out there, just beyond his reach. And Marcus wasn't done searching. Not yet. Marcus stood in the dim light behind the warehouse, the photo clutched tightly in his hand. Relief mixed with a simmering tension in his chest, as if finding the wallet had only scratched the surface of something much deeper. He took a moment to steady his breathing, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The warehouse, the group inside, the stacks of cash, they weren't just random details. Something bigger was at play, and Marcus couldn't walk away now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. He slipped the wallet into his pocket and scanned his surroundings. The man in the hoodie was long gone, his hurried footsteps fading into the night. Marcus considered his next move carefully. Should he return home, satisfied with what he had reclaimed, or dig deeper into the shadows of the story? Every instinct told him to leave it alone, but his gut refused to let go. There was a wrong here that went beyond his personal loss, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something dangerous and significant. The warehouse loomed behind him, silent now, its windows dark. Marcus crept back toward the building, every step deliberate and quiet. He reached the side entrance and pressed his ear to the cold metal door. For a moment, there was only silence, but then he heard faint shuffling noises inside. Someone was still there. His pulse quickened as he leaned back, weighing his options. He couldn't just barge in. It would be reckless and likely end badly. But he needed to know what was going on. Sliding into the shadows, Marcus found another window, this one slightly ajar. He carefully pushed it open and slipped inside, landing softly on the concrete floor. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and oil. He crouched low, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for a few crates and a large table in the center of the room. A single figure stood by the table, their back turned to Marcus. The person was sorting through a pile of items, a mix of stolen goods and cash. Marcus recognized some of the items from the convenience store, including the register drawer. His anger flared again, but he kept his emotions in check. He needed to stay calm, to think strategically. As he watched, the figure muttered something under their breath, their frustration evident in their body language. It was clear they were waiting for someone. Marcus inched closer, staying hidden behind a stack of crates. He strained to hear what the person was saying, but their words were too low to make out. Then the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the space. Marcus froze, his heart pounding as two more figures entered the room. One of them was a tall man with a commanding presence, his voice sharp as he addressed the person at the table. "You've got the money sorted?" the tall man asked, his tone brisk. "Almost," the first figure replied, their voice nervous. but we're short. That last job didn't bring in as much as we thought." The tall man sighed, his frustration palpable. "We can't afford shortfalls, not now. The boss isn't going to like this." Marcus' curiosity deepened. The way they spoke hinted at an organized operation, something far more intricate than a petty theft. He leaned in, careful not to make a sound, as the conversation continued. "We've got another job lined up," the first figure said quickly, as if trying to appease the tall man. "Big payout. It'll cover the difference." "And what about that guy from earlier?" the tall man asked, his tone sharp. "The one who followed you, did you deal with him?" Marcus' breath caught in his throat. They were talking about him. He pressed himself closer to the crate, every muscle tensed as he waited for the response. "I think I lost him," the first figure said, though their voice wavered with uncertainty. "He didn't follow me here." The tall man didn't seem convinced. "You'd better hope you're right. If he shows up again, we're not taking any chances." "Got it." The first figure nodded, their fear evident. "Got it." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't been as unnoticed as he thought, and now he was on their radar. The stakes had just risen, and any misstep could cost him dearly. But instead of retreating, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Whatever this group was involved in, it was bigger than him, bigger than the robbery. He needed to find out who was behind it all and why. The tall man motioned to the door, and the group began to move, their conversation fading as they exited the warehouse. Marcus waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared before stepping out from behind the crates. The room was silent now, the air thick with the weight of what he had just overheard. He approached the table, his eyes scanning the items left behind. Among the scattered bills and stolen goods, he noticed a small notebook. Picking it up, he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. The notebook was filled with names, addresses, and notes, details that hinted at a network of operations far beyond what Marcus had imagined. There were references to other locations, coded messages, and plans for future jobs. This wasn't just a group of petty thieves. It was something organized, something dangerous. And Marcus had just stumbled into the heart of it. As he stood there, the weight of the notebook in his hand, he heard the faint sound of a car engine outside. His pulse quickened. They were coming back. Without thinking, he slipped the notebook into his jacket and darted back to the window, climbing out just as the warehouse door creaked open again. He hit the ground running, his breath coming in short bursts as he disappeared into the night. Marcus didn't stop until he was several blocks away, his legs burning and his heart racing. He ducked into an alley and pulled out the notebook, flipping through it again under the faint glow of a streetlight. The names and notes blurred together as his mind raced. He had uncovered something dangerous, something that could put him in serious danger. But he also knew he couldn't turn back now. The truth was out there, just within reach, and Marcus was determined to find it. Marcus stood in the dimly lit alley, the notebook trembling in his hands as the weight of its contents sank in. He flipped through the pages again, this time more carefully, scanning the names and addresses scribbled in messy handwriting. Each entry seemed to connect to a larger web, a network of individuals who were part of something far more complex than a simple robbery ring. His stomach churned as he realized just how deep this might go. Among the names, one stood out, a familiar one. It was listed alongside an address in a part of town Marcus knew all too well. The name belonged to Elijah, an old friend from Marcus's neighborhood, someone he hadn't spoken to in years but could never forget. Elijah had always been ambitious, talking about making it big, but Marcus never imagined he'd end up mixed in something like this. The name sent a jolt through Marcus, and the address brought an uneasy sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore it. If Elijah was involved, this wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was personal. The sound of a siren in the distance pulled Marcus out of his thoughts. He shoved the notebook back into his jacket and glanced around, making sure no one had followed him. His heart was pounding, but his resolve had hardened. He had to find out what Elijah's role was in all of this. Was he a key player, or was his name just another entry in a long list? The only way to know was to go to that address. As Marcus made his way across town, the streets grew quieter, the glow of streetlights stretching longer shadows. His mind raced with possibilities. Could Elijah have been involved in the robbery? Or was he part of the larger operation behind it? Memories of their past flooded back, Elijah's infectious laugh, the way he'd always looked out for Marcus when they were kids. It was hard to reconcile that image with the one forming in Marcus's mind now. But the notebook didn't lie. Elijah was connected, and Marcus needed answers. When he arrived at the address, a nondescript apartment building on the edge of the city, Marcus hesitated. The building was run down, its paint peeling and windows dark. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the creak of the old wooden door echoing in the narrow hallway. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the door labeled 3B, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorbell. What if Elijah wasn't the person Marcus remembered? What if confronting him made things worse? Before he could decide, the door opened suddenly, and Marcus found himself face to face with Elijah. His old friend's expression shifted from surprise to wary recognition. "Marcus," Elijah said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" Marcus steadied himself, meeting Elijah's gaze. "I need to talk to you," he said. "It's important." Elijah glanced over his shoulder, then stepped aside to let Marcus in. The apartment was small and cluttered, with papers and boxes scattered across the floor. Elijah shut the door behind them, his posture tense. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone guarded. Marcus pulled the notebook from his jacket and held it up. "This," he said. "Your name is in here, Elijah, along with a lot of other things that don't make sense. I need to know what's going on." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "That's not the point," Marcus said. "I want the truth. Are you involved in whatever this is?" Elijah hesitated, his jaw tightening as he weighed his response. Finally, he sighed and motioned for Marcus to sit. "It's not what you think," he said. "I'm not running any of this. I got pulled into it. Forced, really. These people, Marcus, they're dangerous. You don't just walk away from them." Marcus leaned forward, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. "So you're just going along with it, letting them hurt people, rob stores, ruin lives?" Elijah's expression hardened. "You think I like this? You think I wanted any of this? They got leverage on me, Marcus. They know things that could destroy me. I don't have a choice." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He wanted to believe Elijah, to see the friend he once knew, but the notebook told a different story. "You always have a choice," Marcus said quietly. "You just have to be willing to fight for it." Elijah shook his head, his frustration evident. "You don't understand, man. These people, they don't just stop. If they even suspect you're trying to cross them, you're done." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the door. Both men froze, their eyes locking in silent understanding. Elijah moved quickly to the window, peering through the blinds. His face paled. "They're here," he whispered. "You have to go. Now." Marcus stood, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but he hesitated. "Come with me," he said. "We can figure this out together." Elijah shook his head, backing away. "It's too late for that. Just go, Marcus. Please." The desperation in Elijah's voice was enough to convince him. Marcus slipped out the back door, his heart racing as he fled into the night. As he disappeared into the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The stakes had just been raised, and Marcus knew the battle was far from over.